We're going to talk about making it work, right? So we're going to talk about action plans here. As you can see, my approach and my style is a little bit different from everybody else you heard today. I am not an academic. I'm a coach. I have lots of experience. However, I take all of the information that you all produce and make it practical and help you learn how to implement it using other scientific approaches as well. Oops, let me get my, there we go. So what are we going to talk about today? Today we're going to cover, we're going to do a quick intro. I'm going to tell you a little bit of background about precision nutrition and myself, talk about what the problem with nutrition coaching is and sports nutrition. We're going to go over some of what we would identify as the new rules of sports nutrition. Not entirely new, it's just some old things tweaked a little bit. And we're going to talk about building the plan and then a little summary. So I wanted to give you a quick picture, a little bio of myself. I am a level 2 masterclass instructor for the Precision Nutrition level 2 course. It's a year-long master's course in coaching. I have been a full-time health coach for about 7 years. I've been health coaching totally for 10 years. So this has ranged from working with individuals to professional sports teams. I've coached over 1,000 clients, and I've had over 500 coaches and students in our coaching program. And you see, I have some pictures on here. I've gone through and used these tools in this process myself. I lost over 125 pounds 10 years ago. I went from that obese picture in the upper left, where you see me preparing about 2 pounds of bacon. I was not on a keto or Atkins diet of that sort. I just like to eat a lot. And using the techniques that we're talking about and some of the information that you heard about earlier, I was able to put these things into play and reduce my body fat drastically, changing my lifestyle. And you see on the right-hand side here, I am an active athlete still. So I'm 43, I still play rugby. That picture actually popped up in my time hop. That was from today, a year ago. I would be playing a match today if there wasn't COVID. So the things that we're talking about, and why is this relevant? The things I'm going to talk about, the system and implementation of the practical knowledge, like I said, was something that I used. And that's why my own personal story is relevant here. So a little bit about precision nutrition. We have coached over 100,000 clients in total over the last decade or so, ranging from individuals to professional athletes. We've had over 70,000 coaches in our certifications. And we also have nutrition coaching software that supports other nutritionists and coaches. We've dealt with elite athletes, and we have a roster of them that we work with. And you see the 2017 US champion, Sloane Stephens. The system that I'm going to talk about is something that we used with her. Sloane has some very special nutritional needs that we needed to work with her and teach her how to manage. We've worked with other professional teams, the Spurs, the Seahawks, the Panthers, etc. So we've been around the block. So let's talk about what the problem is. Well, in the beginning, when we first started, we kind of use the information dispensing model. We think of our clients as empty vessels, and we assume that we're just going to give them information, and we're going to fill them with more information and keep doing so, and assume that they're going to take that information and putting it into practice. So it was back in the mid-2000s when PN began, we started offering this information dispensing model using articles and other methods to dispense the most recent cutting edge information that we would take from places like ISSN and other research and package it to give it to the public. The idea is that we're the experts. We have the information. We're going to give you this. This is what you use. We take the stuff and you use it and you succeed. But that's not really what happens. We assumed that everybody we were giving the information to was over here. We assumed that there were these level 3 type people. And we treated everybody that way. And that's typically what we see a lot of when we have the information dispensing model. The information out there is the most detailed, bleeding edge stuff, but it's not necessarily practical or even implementable by most people, even athletes. And we'll talk about that. So we tend to think of all athletes as more skilled than they really are. They tend to think that they're more skilled as well. They're worried about nutrient timing and specific macro recommendations and supplements and stuff, when in some cases, they don't even know what protein is. And that is not even an exaggeration. Most of the time we find them doing things like this. They're mowing the lawn while their house is burning down. I've had a 300-pound offensive lineman asking me about, what the best pre-workout supplement is, when his coaches were telling him to drop down to 270. I don't know why they wanted him lighter, but they did. He was worried about pre-workout, and all the other things that mattered were out the window. So, we have all of these studies. We have studies upon studies. We have position stands from ISSN. We give these people the best info. Why are they not entirely successful? Like, this is always the question, and this is what we were out to solve. We actually realized after, dealing with several thousand clients and had them getting decent results, maybe okay, not the best, we realized that our job is actually behavior change. It really is. We're all about building relationships, teaching skills, and creating an environment that gives people through the change process to long-term success. Information is not enough, okay? It's not. We can have the best information in the world, but that doesn't mean we're going to have the best, healthiest people or the best, healthiest athletes or whatever. Information is certainly not enough. So let's take a look at a new perspective on sports nutrition and maybe what the gaps are here. So when we think about sports nutrition, what comes to mind? Is it the lean, ripped bodies of professional athletes? Advanced macro ratios that are administered and closely monitored, biochemistry, nutrient timing, cutting edge supplementation. Usually it's all of the above, right? Answer A, B, C, D. That's everybody's favorite, all of the above. That's the typical answer. And that's great. And I love this stuff, but there is one problem. And the problem is that even collectively, these responses represent only a small slice of what sports nutrition is really about. So the first rule to examine here is don't treat all athletes the same. And this is like, well, that's not new. That seems like common sense, right? There's a little tweak on this. We don't want, and this is common sense here, we don't want to compare or treat the same a high school athlete who's in their teens, to a professional athlete who isn't the same as a regular person who works out in the gym 4 hours a day hard, to a person who maybe does heavy manual labor, like a firefighter or an operator. When we look at this in the way we've always looked at individualization in the past from sports nutrition perspective, it's always been focused on the science of nutrients and making prescriptive, idealized recommendations, right? What is ideal here? That's why we do the research. We need that, but that's not the whole thing. It's not the whole picture. So, we look at athletes and we look at their thing, we look at what they do, we look at their sport type, we look at their body weight and height, all the stuff going back to what Kurt was just talking about. We look at their exercise duration, intensity, their current training cycle, the competitive schedule, all of this stuff. But in our experience, nutrients, simple body measurements, and sports-based factors are not enough to get clients or athletes to succeed. There is more to the person than their stats and their training schedule. And this is where we get into some of the interesting stuff. Enter movement nutrition. So movement nutrition is kind of what we've coined as the term, and it goes beyond just the science of nutrients and prescriptive recommendations, like eat, 150 grams of protein. It goes beyond that, and it looks at coaching the person in the whole context of their life. So it includes science of nutrition, of course, that's why we're here. The science of behavior, There are people involved. It also looks at the skills and practices of systematic coaching and the context of the client's or athlete's entire life and the view of the client or the athlete as a complete person. They're not just someone that shows up to play a sport. So with movement nutrition, you can still use nutrition science, but you expand your perspective to better understand and help each athlete as an individual, okay? Athletes aren't just moving bodies, they're real unique people with real unique lives. We can't ignore their the psychological and social health of them. So here's an example, right? You've got Jen here, and Jen wants to qualify for nationals in a lower weight class as a weightlifter. You think simple, right? We're just going to gather the info about her current height and weight, what she's eating, how she's training, and use that to create a plan to create a calorie deficit. We're going to chip away together and slowly, and she'll succeed, right? Easy. Well, here's what you don't know about Jen, okay? She's commuting to law school. She spends more time in the car than she does out of it, which means she eats plenty of fast food and sodas and other convenient foods. She stays with her dad on the weekends, okay? He's super supportive of her lifting goals. He was a power lifter himself and a record holder at that. He's a proponent of the eat big and lift big school of thought, and he's not really supportive of her getting smaller. So in a way, Jen feels alone in her quest to drop this weight class so she can be successful in her sport. Also, between school, student loans, checking on her dad, working at a part-time job, Jen is struggling to focus on her health and performance. She's got a lot of other things pulling on her. All of these factors are making it harder for her to stick to a plan that you've created for her, okay? If we gave her a complicated nutrient timing plan with specific macros, it's going to be a hard time with her. She's got other things that are important. This is where many of the spaces or many of the approaches in sports nutrition kind of go wrong. We forget about these other things or we just ignore them altogether. So enter the biopsychosocial model. So Jen's initial weight cutting plan, like we talked about, only took into account the biological factors, like her physical stats or eating habits and her training routine. However, the psychological factors and the social context are also important parts of the big picture. So Jen's stressed from school, feeling alone, commuting in a less than ideal environment, and getting pressure from her father. You need to understand all of this if you're going to be able to put together a plan that she will adhere to and that will work for her. We can't live and operate in ideals because most people don't. So we also, for the third rule here, we want to expand your definition of the word athlete. So typically we think of sports nutrition as something geared towards people who are elite in some way, pro basketball players, competitive marathon runners, even, you know, a high school sports star. That's kind of where people think when you think of athletes or athletes sports nutrition, excuse me. We're asking you to maybe expand this and look at these categories. So these categories overlap, and all athletes are movers, of course, but not all movers or exercisers are athletes. People can move in and out of these categories as well. As you saw in my picture that I showed you before, I went from being, you know, a couch surfer to a rugby athlete. Although when I was 300 plus pounds, I was still playing rugby, but not very well. I was just not getting around. So basically the point here is that most people are not professional athletes, okay? We can help all active people though, with nutritional support. The fourth rule here is to focus on the fundamentals before advanced nutrition methods. Again, it sounds like common sense, but often in reality, this is thrown out the window by nutritionists. So the biochemistry is awesome. And when you've got the science of nutrition down, it's really tempting to rely on the highest level, you know, most innovative cutting edge protocols you can think of. But The reality is even the most talented athletes aren't always advanced nutritionally. In fact, they're usually missing fundamental nutrition skills. So here you see LeBron James eating McDonald's. There are several of these elite athletes that love McDonald's and then talk about it. So it's interesting that, when you think of elite athletes, you think of elite nutrition. Most of them don't know and they don't eat well. You have some that do, but the majority of them don't. Here's another example. You've got 18-year-old Steven. He's a freak athlete. He's an NBA and college scout dream. He's on top. What's his diet secret? Well, it's Burger King, Pizza Hut, Taco Bell, Frosted Flakes with big gulps from 7-Eleven, right? It's whatever's cheap and fast for him. What we really know though is that his true secret is youth, lots of activity, and really good genes. And these things will run out during an athletic career, and a poor diet will accelerate that. So we want to work with him to change these things. And when it comes to athletes, Steven is closer to the norm than he is the outlier. Most athletes are like this guy. He wants to last through college and into the pros and knows that he probably needs to do some things differently. So giving him a complicated plan with specific macro ratios and meal timings, probably not the best idea. Considering what he's currently eating and how he's currently eating, it's probably not going to work. So we will need to simplify it and help him to develop fundamental skills. So the fifth rule here is using a systematic coaching method. And that's what we're going to talk more about. So you need a coaching plan, and not just any old plan. You need a method. So one that can be customized for a variety of client types, one that provides a roadmap to help you ensure that you're meeting the client's unique needs, and so that they know what the big picture of the process looks like as well. We need one that helps you to use the best available evidence to guide your decisions. So this is evidence-based practice at its finest, right? We are looking at the science and intersecting it with practitioner experience as the coach and personal preference, that's the athlete. This is the intersection of that. This is where we develop the PN coaching method. So it's a 6-step method and process that can ask the right questions and take the right actions at the right time. And this methodology is actually has been validated and is in 3 peer-reviewed research studies, which I've linked in the back of this presentation. So overall, we need to consider and plan for the whole person, not just the biology. All right, so how do we do this? We're going to build the plan. And the first step of this is to understand change. We always are resisting change, always. Even if it is something we want, there is resistance. There's always going to be some bit of resistance to change. So if we look at the basic psychological needs of people, they need to have autonomy, which gives them control and ownership of the choices that they make. We need to have competence, so effective in the tasks that we choose to do. This is a big part. This is where a lot of this system comes in, building that. And we need to have relatedness, and that's belonging and connecting to others. And that's where the coaches come in and how they relate to their athletes. All 3 of these parts are necessary in helping someone implement the changes that they want, okay? In this case, obviously, we're referring to sports nutrition implementation and interventions. The action plan model is about building competence while incorporating autonomy. The coach practitioner needs to build the relatedness with the athlete, as I had mentioned. And a foundation for a lot of this is the trans-theoretical model of change, right? Where people start off in pre-contemplation. This is where they don't intend to take action or in the foreseeable future, which is typically defined as like 6 months. And typically people are unaware of their behavior as being problematic. In the contemplation stage, this is where people are intending to take some action. They're starting to think about it. And in the foreseeable future, which we would call 6 months, people recognize that their behavior may be problematic, and more thoughtful and practical consideration of pros and cons may be taking place. The next phase is preparation, which is often called determination. In this stage, people are ready to take action within the next 30 days. They start to take small steps towards behavior change and believe changing their behavior can lead to a healthier life or the outcome they desire. And then finally, there's the action stage, where people have recently changed their behavior and they intend to keep moving forward with that behavior change. People may exhibit this by modeling their own problem behavior or acquiring new healthy behaviors. By modifying, not modeling. From there, we would go to maintenance. And in this stage, this is where you have sustained behavior change for a while, and that's typically defined as more than 6 months. This is where you intend to maintain the behavior going forward indefinitely. People in this stage work to prevent relapse to earlier stages. And then there's one that's not listed in here, and that's termination. And that's when people decide that the change doesn't mean anything to them anymore, and they just let it go. That's rarely reached. So we're not showing that. So the action plan approach is about keeping people in action and moving them through these stages, moving them up from pre-contemplation to contemplation to preparation to action, and then eventually getting them to maintenance and teaching them the skills to stay there. We also have to understand that all change has ambivalence, and like I said before, all change involves resistance. So these things are what keep people from moving through those phases and or cause them to relapse. So if we really want to help people change, we have to work with them, not against them. We want to look for what's good rather than what they're doing wrong. We want to establish clear actions, and that's moving from skills to goals to skills, and then from skills to practices, and then from practices to these small manageable daily actions. And then we want to match coaching to nutritional level. So I showed you a slide earlier. Typically, we categorize our people into 3 categories: level 1, level 2, and level 3 nutritional knowledge. And we need to match their skills based on that. This is where we talk about the GSPA model. That stands for goal, skill, practice, action. So you have your person or yourself, and you have this goal, right above me here. And then we go over here to skills. So you need skills to reach your goal. To acquire skills, we need to do that through purposeful, intentional practice. How do you practice? What does that look like? Well, that's by taking these small daily actions or near daily actions that you can implement. And then you just keep iterating through this. It is a top-down approach when planned out on paper or online in some software. Okay, so the goal is up at the top. What are the skills you need for the goal? What are the practices to acquire that skill? And how are you implementing that as far as action goes in a daily space? Here's a specific example. So to build that goal, you need to build the skills, okay? As I had mentioned, and then to acquire those skills, you need to practice. So the interesting thing is the daily action. So the daily action are these small specific tasks that you take. Over time, I'm gonna move out of the way here, those become habits. The daily actions are what become habits. We used to call them habits, but after some pressure from myself, it's not a habit until it's a habit. It's an action. So we call these actions now, and then eventually they develop into habits. So if you think back to one of the earlier slides, Jen, the weightlifter that I showed you from before, she had a goal to implement a nutritional strategy to make a lower weight class with little to no performance impact, okay? And the skills to acquire that goal would be to eat appropriate nutrients, choose higher quality foods, eat well consistently, tolerate stress, get quality sleep, plan, prioritize, prepare, and maybe utilize supplements. An action that might fall under one of those skills, specifically we'll talk about appropriate nutrients. The action for that might be eat enough protein, eat enough carbohydrates, eat enough fats, eat enough veggies, hydrate properly. So based on hundreds of thousands of clients, we've identified what the most common skills and practices for people need, or what the most common skills and practices for people are, and what they need to become consistent with the basics. So we have broken them into categories, taking into account the biopsychosocial model. I know that's kind of small. It's probably tough to read here, but you see these are broken into categories. There's the nutrition, sleep and recovery, movement, deep health. At the skill level, we have eat appropriate nutrients, choose higher quality foods, eat well consistently, self-regulate eating, and they go on. So we'll drill down into one of these so we can see specifically what it might look like and how we might implement it. So if you have someone with the goal of eat better consistently so I can lose weight, perhaps one of the first skills that they need to acquire is to regulate their eating behavior. And how would we do that? Perhaps for this individual, there's going to be a practice of eating slowly and mindfully, right? This is going to help them to also build another skill that might be, this is going to help them to build that skill of regulating their eating behaviors. Another practice in this space might be eating until satisfied. But we're looking at this one, eat slowly and mindfully. What does that daily action look like? So at that action level, it might be something like at each meal, put your utensil down between the bite and take at least one breath. Like, how are you actually doing this thing? This is going to look different person to person. The practice for you and I and for everybody else might be the same, but the implementation of it is going to look different. This is the action level. So the practices tend to be where things like the ISSN position stands fall, right? How much of what to eat and when. The action level, this is the individual implementation piece. At the action level, we may need to adjust based on the individual's confidence of doing the action. So even if the science says, yes, you need to eat X amount of X nutrient at X time, if the person can't do it in the context of their life, that means nothing to them. We have to adjust these things so it fits into their life. So the way we test this is by testing confidence. And this is a question that I typically ask people. On a scale of 1 to 10, how confident are you can do this action after every single time, no matter what? And we want to get a 9 or a 10 answer. The goal here is to improve their say-do ratio. So we want to adjust things to fit as best as possible. The way we determine the order is using this 5S formula. They need to be sequential, strategic, supported, simple, and segmental. Remember, clients all have different identities, values, and priorities. And this is going to influence how confident they are in implementation of these things, because different things are important to them and pull them in different directions. Here's an actual example of one of my clients and the action plan that I built for him. This guy was a heavyweight wrestler at Arizona State, and he was a very good one. He was a state champion in his hometown, in his home state, before he went away to college. And I believe he was a national runner-up twice in college. So this is a man here who I built this action plan for. This is one segment of it. You see he had a skill for him to get the day going properly. He needed to have a solid morning routine. This was the first skill we needed to build before we could do anything else, before I could even address how much of what to eat. We needed to do this first. So his skill was this solid morning routine. His journal, the first practice to build that skill for him was journaling and planning. And how did it look specifically for him? He decided he was going to do, there's a journal called Best Self, and he was going to do the morning pages of that Best Self journal on a daily basis. And you see here, these are all the questions and other details that fill out this thing. This is what, these questions over here are the things that typically will solidify the say-do ratio. So if someone says they'll do the thing, if you go through this process, their likelihood of doing the thing goes way up. We want people to succeed at what they say they will succeed at. So you ask questions like, what does this actually look like? So I'll tell them, how are you going to do that? When are you doing it? Where are you doing it? How are we going to measure? So like, how do I measure your success of action? That's another thing that we get into. What does success look like? I ask them about roadblocks, etc. So here's something you may recognize, okay? I'm going to bring this back into a more familiar space. So remember when I said this is a top-down planning approach? Well, it takes a certain amount of time to acquire a skill, and a person needs to do several practices around the skill typically. That is also a certain amount of time. So there's also the amount of time that it takes for the whole thing. So we can roughly plan how long it takes to implement all of these skills through practice for a person. We might plan it out 6 months, a year, whatever. At least now we have a timeline and we have a plan that's laid out. It's not hodgepodge. And it's very similar to the sports periodization model. The time it takes to reach the goal would be the macro cycle. The time it takes that the time that you're spending on each skill, because we're doing them one at a time, putting one in focus, putting the other one on the back burner when we move on, that's like a mesocycle, right? So I'm in a power block, I'm in a speed block. Well, those are skills, just like here, maybe the skill of eating appropriate nutrients and the skill of eating quality nutrients. Those are separate skills. And then from there, the microcycles are the time that it takes to do the practices. Typically, there's going to be like 1 to 2 weeks for each of these. That's enough time for people to get traction and to build some competency, but they don't get bored. Usually, if you go after more than 2 weeks, people tend to get bored in this approach, unless they're really focused on a thing. And that's okay. You can go longer or shorter. And then the action level, this is what daily training looks like, okay? This is where we vary frequency, intensity, volume. This is where these things change. So I had a client, I'll give you an example. I had a client who was an airline pilot, and his skill was that he was working on what was the skill of hunger and appetite awareness. He never really knew when he was truly hungry or when he was actually full. So we were trying to build that skill. And one of the practices that we were working on was eating slowly. We know, right, it takes about 20 minutes for the body to catch up as far as satiety goes. So we like our people to eat slowly when appropriate. This particular client was an airline pilot. And when I asked him how confident he was that he could eat slowly, 10 out of 10, or on a scale of 10 out of 10 at every meal, he wasn't very confident at all. He was like a 5. And I asked him why. What would it take to improve it? And what are you not so confident about? And he told me that he flew 4 days a week. And when he was working and flying, he very rarely had time to eat. So typically his meals look like him shoveling in something fast in the cockpit. So to improve that say-do ratio, we decided that the goal for his practice would be to practice eating slowly 3 days a week, the 3 days he wasn't working. So we threw the other 4 days out because now it looks like, you know, he's successful at what he's going out to do. This builds confidence. And this is what moves people up the trans-theoretical model. This is what moves people up that model or down the model. And this is what builds people's confidence to want to do more and to do more advanced things. So the action plan will always improve outcomes. Always, always, always. So in summary, information is not enough. We need to consider and plan for the whole person. Action plans improve outcomes. I know Tricia is going to throw questions out there and leave this out for people. But while we're gathering questions, I'll say if you need to reach me or have other questions you think of after the fact, you can find me in any of these spaces. Email me, find me on Instagram. If you go to my Instagram, I'm usually putting like stupid human tricks on there and other things like my kids climbing, fun stuff. And here's a link for you as well, where you can download some infographics and tools that will help you implement the amazing biochemistry that we all know is leading the way here.
Great, thanks so much. That was awesome. We do have some questions. I'm going to start with a couple questions from Eric here. Do you think keeping a morning routine is something all clients should do?
No. It's going to be different for each person. So for some people, maybe the preparation is great in the morning. They have a good morning routine. For other people, that morning routine may actually be an evening routine. Mm-hmm. Right? Where they prep their food and prep their clothes for the next day and get everything ready. And that's part of their bedtime routine. Again, it all comes back to the individual. Like, what can they do? What can they not do? Where are they running into issues? And working with them, letting them lead the way. That's where we decide where we want to go.
Great. A follow-up from Eric here. And he had mentioned, thanks so much for the presentation. Have you found that there is an optimal follow-up time for clients? So weekly, bi-weekly, et cetera, after an initial consultation? Yeah,
that's a good question. I'd like to meet with people weekly or bi-weekly. Obviously, depending on your client load, that is going to vary and make a bigger difference. If you're working with a team that has 100 athletes, you may not be able to see each person each week. So you're going to have to adjust. Ideally, you would make a touch point, at least a touch point if it's not in face or face to face. Ideally, you'd at least touch base with them at the longest 2 weeks.
Okay, every 2 weeks or at 2 weeks after the initial consultation. Great. In terms of your contact, do you use email, text message, phone call after that initial consultation?
Yeah, it's another great question. All of them. All of them. So for example, in our in the level 2 coaching course, I give people a phone number where they can text me if they need to get me immediately. Same thing with my coaching clients and athletes. They also are working through software, which we use to implement this action plan. So a lot of the messaging about their stuff happens there. But if they need me urgently or need something answered right away, they don't want to go into the system, that's when they text me. And I also keep clear time in my calendar, and I give them a link where they can schedule their own meetings with me if they need to. So I give them options.
Mm-hmm. Do you ever feel like it's kind of invading on your personal life a little bit if people are texting you?
Yes. I have become very good at drawing boundaries. So the text number that I give out is an internet text number. I can shut that thing off at a certain time. It turns back on the next at a certain time. So at least I'm replying to people like 12 hours or less if they're texting me. If they text me, I'm usually getting back to them within minutes, but I definitely make boundaries there. And that's part of why I use that scheduler to contain my time when people want to meet with me. It's like, find a time in my calendar. And if you can't find a time, let me know. I'll see if I can shuffle something around. Other than that, I let them figure out where to put it in for themselves.
Yeah, that's great. Another question here. What is your opinion or position on starting a client on an elimination diet to identify foods that work or fit best with their individual body? When, if at all, would you recommend a practice such as this?
Oh man, I typically would not want to start someone with an individual with an elimination diet. Let me back that off. That is based on the majority of the clients that I see. The majority of them, if I started them with an elimination diet, they would fail. So we have data that shows if you change 3 or more things for a person at one time, 1 out of 10 of them will be successful. That's the robot that doesn't need help in general. They will do whatever you want, whatever, right? You tell them and they will do it. That's 1 out of 10. So if you change 2 things, that success rate goes up to 3 out of 10. And if you only change 1 thing at a time, that goes up to about 8 out of 10. So going slow and making it in smaller pieces really jacks up the success rate. So if we think about what a standard diet is, or like an elimination diet, it's overhauling everything all at once. And a lot of times these people can't manage that. So you can actually implement that elimination diet, if you like though, if you feel like that's something that the person might need through that program. So you could actually build out your skills where it might look like, I'm going to go back to the main one here. Here we go. Where you're looking at eat appropriate nutrients. So that's portions. But then when we get to choose higher quality foods, that might be where you start talking to them about how you make the choice. So if we're focused on choosing better quality protein,